All right, this lesson is on selection tools and how they're going to help you manipulate your images. We're going to start off by going with one of the most basic selections that you can do, and that's your rectangular marquee, and that's this one here. I'm going to go ahead and select it. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the layer that I want to manipulate. I'm just going to click, hold down, and drag. And I have this area. And what I can do with this is I can copy and paste this into a new layer, or I can just simply move it from where it's at, or just delete this area if I didn't want it, or I can mask it, or I can manipulate it with color, change the color in just a specific area. Okay, so what I'm just going to do right now for the purposes of demonstrating this tool really quick is I'm going to just tell you how to cut it out. I'm going to cut it out, and then I'm going to create a new layer, and then I can paste it in there. Okay, say that you only needed that part of the image, then you'd be left with that part of the image in its own layer. Okay, now in this one you could technically delete if you wanted to. Okay, but we don't want to do that. I'm going to go ahead and step back a few steps in my history palette. Okay, and to deselect something like this, I can just do Command D. Similarly, you have the elliptical marquee. And again, with this one, you could either cut it out, paste it into a new layer. You could just manipulate the color in this area. You could just adjust the contrast in this area. Basically, what a selection does is allows you to manipulate the selected areas of an image any way you wish, okay? Now we're going to learn to do that in other lessons, how to adjust the color balance and the contrast and the levels in subsequent lessons. So I'm not going to get into that, and I'm just showing you the basics of what you can do with selections, okay, with these tools. All right. And now another one that I want to show you is, say that you want to cut out this image of the camera from this space here. Because it's taken on a white background and the image here is primarily black, there's a nice contrast, a nice edge around here that will allow me to select this area using this tool called the wand tool. I'm going to click, hold down, and drag, and it's a magic wand tool here. All right. I'm just going to go ahead and click on the white area. Okay. And then I could just delete that if I wanted. Okay. So this is where the suggestion comes in. If you'll notice in your photo shoot tips that I suggest you photographing things on like a plain background that's opposite color so that you can easily extract it this way if you're just photographing objects, okay? Or even people. If you just put them up against a white background or something that contrasts what they're wearing and their hair and facial features, you can usually do that. Things without a lot of texture. All right, now typically I don't recommend using the delete key or the backspace key or even the eraser tool that we have here because it's very permanent. Once you delete it, you can't get the image back unless you re-import the image. So what I suggest is doing a mask instead, which will allow you to do basically the same thing, okay, just with a few extra steps. But I'm not going to go over those. Those are covered in another lecture. So make sure you take a look at those if you want to learn more about masks and other things you can do with these selections, all right? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and deselect, Command D. Now, if I wanted to go ahead and try to use this tool on this flower image, it's not going to quite work. I'm going to go make sure that I'm on my flower layer. And if I just click here, notice that it only selects the range of areas. The options here that you have are for you to change like the tolerance here. You can change the tolerance here, and basically if you move it down, it's going to only pick colors that are very, very similar to where you clicked. If you make the number larger, then it's going to be a little bit more forgiving and select more areas, okay? So if I were to change this to, say, 80, okay? And then I just do a click again. Notice it selected more areas, okay? So that compared to that, okay? So that's what the tolerance does, okay? But still, I'm not getting what I want here, okay? Over here, when I did it, I didn't even have to go and change any of these settings, okay? Now, if you did want to use this and you wanted to keep adding to the selection, you could click on this one here. And that one allows you to add. So when you click, it'll let you keep adding. Notice it just grabbed more, grabbed more, grabbed more. Okay, now it's almost selecting the whole image. Okay, but this isn't going to work to like cut this image out or manipulate that flower, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and deselect. And that brings me to the next tool that I want to cover. If I go ahead and click here, the quick selection tool, let me go ahead and click that one. And this one allows me to specify a brush size, specify whether I'm adding to the selection, taking away from the selection. By default, it should be in normal mode here, okay? And you can change the brush size, as we mentioned here, and then go and click here. Notice this brush size is kind of small, but that's okay because it kind of detects the edges of this image. And I'm going to go ahead and click around here. I'm just going to move this over. Notice that it's automatically checked itself off to keep adding here. Okay. And another key thing is to make sure you're always on your layer, okay? And notice that it did a pretty good job at selecting that. But really what I'm doing is I didn't select the image here. So if I wanted to manipulate what's inside here, I would need to do what's called an inverse, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and do a select inverse. Okay, and now even though it looks very similar, I know that I'm actually selecting the inside, okay? Just because it's doing the opposite of what I selected on this particular layer. Now, say that I wanted to burn or dodge or do anything, like say, let's do burn. That'll probably be more apparent. If I go and I click over here, notice it's only manipulating this area here, okay? And it's not because the highlights is selected and I'm using the dodge and burn. I can change it to midtones. And basically, it's only manipulating the area inside. Notice if I take a paintbrush to it and I start painting with it, it only confines it to that area inside, okay? So what you want to remember is that you have the ability to select certain areas so that you can manipulate them only if you don't want to affect other areas, okay? So you can use these tools to either copy and paste them onto a new layer. You can use them to manipulate, to draw on just a certain area, to change the color, things like that, okay? I'm going to go ahead and deselect, Command D. And I'm going to introduce you to another tool. This is the Lasso tool here. The Lasso tool can create selections, okay, but it does them in a different way. I'm just going to go ahead and select the Lasso tool. Notice we have options up here such as the feather radius. I'll talk about the other options as the lesson goes along, but the feather radius allows us to make a selection fuzzy at the edges as opposed to clean, crisp edges when we make the selection. We're going to keep it at 0 here so that we can get a clean, crisp selection. But just so you know that where the option is to make a fuzzy selection or a feathered selection, that's where it's at. And you would do it ahead of time before making the selection with your Lasso tool. And this is usually like if you're only targeting a specific area, you can go in here and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. I can go ahead and just select the area that I want to manipulate. Notice it's not working right along the edge, okay? This one, it's so that you can add to selections or take away from selections when they're not really adhering to the edge that you want. So you can go in here and keep adding to the selection. Similarly, you would select this button here, or if you hold down Shift, it'll also give you that option, okay? And you can add to the selection. All you would need to do is encapsulate that area that you want to add. So I'm just drawing it more carefully. You'd have to have a steady hand for this tool. And we'd go in here. Okay, and I'm purposely going to make a mistake and go a little bit over. And if I wanted to remove, I would just select this tool here or hold down my Option key, okay, or Alt on a PC. And I'm going to encapsulate that area to then remove it, okay? So this one, when you make a selection with one of the other tools and you notice there's little tweaks, things that aren't quite working and you want to go in there and finesse it, you could use this tool as well. Now with this, say that you just wanted to change this area here. Because it's selected, you could do the same thing. You could just like, say, paint on it. So that's the Lasso tool. The polygonal Lasso tool is more for things that have straight edges. So if you have something that has a straight edge, this is what it does. It basically clicks in lines. I'm just clicking, 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 okay? And then you just have to make sure you come all the way around so it knows what area to encapsulate, okay? I'm just going to go ahead and deselect this, Command D. All right. The next tool, we're going to go to Magnetic Lasso tool. And this one kind of works like the quick selection tool, in that it detects the edges. I'm just clicking, hold down, and dragging and going around. And sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's not. It's usually pretty good to just give you a rough selection that then you can finesse, okay? And the cool thing about it is that you can go even inside the image and it'll detect, okay? So I'm just going around in here, and you have to be kind of careful, go along the edge if you want it to work. And then I'm just going to click OK. All right, so same thing, you could manipulate just the area within that selected piece, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and deselect and zoom out. Okay, so this last tool that I want to cover is the pen tool selection, okay? This is probably one of the most important ones because you can most cleanly select your objects, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the pen tool. And notice that you get all these options up here. And notice that you also have modifier tools in here, such as the path selection tool and the direct selection tool, so you can make modifications, okay? So I'm going to go back to that pen tool. And in here, what you want to make sure is that you're selected on the pen tool, that you have selected path, because if you're on shape, that means that you can draw just like an Illustrator. It will create a vector shape inside your layers, okay? So I'm going to make sure that we're on path. And then these options we're going to end up needing after we finish making our path. And this one here, you want to make sure that it's selected. By default, it should be selected. It's path operations. You got to click here where it says exclude overlapping areas. And what that exclude overlapping areas does is basically this area here we're going to need to trace, and this area here we're going to need to trace. So those paths are overlapping or sharing the same space. So therefore we need to make sure that in order for this to punch out when we need it to, that option is selected. All right, so to trace around this image, you would just click, hold down and drag, do all this, okay? And you'd keep going all the way around, okay? Okay, so you would keep going all the way around. I'm going to do it quick. It's not going to be perfect, and I'm okay with that for right now. You would want to concentrate on yours better than what I'm doing. Just going all the way around. All the way around. Make sure that it closes the path here. All right, and then I'm going to click here, here, go all the way around. I don't worry if it's not perfect on my first run, because I know that I have modifier tools here that I could use. Okay. All right, so you should go in there and modify this and make it look perfect. I'm not going to do that for the purposes of demonstration, okay? Once you're done modifying, though, if you are done modifying, what I always suggest, and this is the tricky one, is that if you only have this part selected, it's only going to manipulate that area. So I always suggest after you're done manipulating, go to your path selection tool, and then here in the paths palette where it's been building itself, just go ahead and click off and then click on it, okay? And that means that when nothing is selected like this, but it's selected here in your paths palette, then that means that it's all selected, okay? And again, your paths palette, like all your other windows, are under Window, Paths, okay? Mine's already open. All right, so you've managed to do the tracing, all right? You had all your settings set correctly. You have your work path here. And now basically you're ready to save this path. So I'm going to go ahead and double click this, and I'm going to call it lock. Okay. Now it's stored in here. Anytime that I make any manipulation here, it'll reflect it in this little preview that you see right there. Okay. All right. So making sure that the lock is selected, I'm going to go back to my pen tool because that's usually what you work with when you're working with paths. And now I'm able to use these options that are right here. Okay. I'm going to do a selection. But first, before I do a selection, I want to make sure that I'm on the correct image, okay? So the path is this tracing outline. The image is in the layers, okay? So here I am actually on the right image. So that means that when I go in here and I make selections, I'm going to make a selection. You'll get this dialog box here, which will allow you to change the radius. If I change the feather radius to a larger number, it will make the edge fuzzy, kind of like a fuzzy brush. But if I leave it at 0, then it'll be a really pristine cut as if it was done with scissors, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 0, and I'm just going to hit OK. And now what you'll notice is that you've got that clean selection, okay? Now, if you were to move the image, because the image is separate from this path, and just in case you need to recut it again for whatever reason, I always suggest that you make a duplicate of your original image at the original size so that you can always apply the path to it and cut it out again should you need it, okay? So I didn't do this here, but just as a precaution, I would say duplicate the layer so you always have the original. Okay, so I'm going to do that here as a precaution. I'm going to duplicate the layer here, okay? Now that I have this selected, in theory, I can manipulate just the way that I manipulated these other objects, okay? So I'm on the appropriate layer. So if I paint, it'll go into this area, okay? Now, granted, you're probably not going to want to paint. A lot of times what you want to do with this is turn it into a mask or change the color of it. And you're going to learn how to do all of those things in another lesson, okay? So right now I was just showing you how to select the area so that you can then manipulate it, such as using like the burn tool or other tools that you've already learned, okay? Notice it's confining. It's not changing the keyboard. It's only changing the lock. I'll step back so you can see it, okay? So basically these selections allow you to manipulate only a given area, all right? Now I'm going to undo from here, okay, so that I can show you what some of the other options you have when you have these selections, okay? So I'm going to go back, back, back. Now one thing you can do with selections, okay, is you can save the selection, all right? Now typically because you have access to the path that has this tracing, you wouldn't necessarily need to save the selection of the lock, okay?
But say for instance when you hand draw a selection, say for instance like here, I'm going to go ahead and select one of these petals, okay? And say that you want to recall this again because you may decide to change it later. What you can do is you can go to Select, Save Selection, name your selection here. Okay, then hit OK. And what you'll notice is that if you deselect this and then later on you want to access that same petal again for whatever reason, you can go ahead and go to Select, Load Selection, and then in this Channels layer, you can check the one that says Flower Petal, then hit OK, and it'll recall that selection again, okay? So it's good as you start selecting things to get into the habit of saving the selections, just in case you need to use them again. You don't have to go and reselect that certain object again, okay? Okay, this concludes your lessons on the selection tool and how to save selections and recall selections. If you have any questions, I led at hawaii.edu or 808-343-9565.